Down on your knees. The words, spoken by Seraphina Blackwood, were not a shriek. They were far worse. Each was a perfectly polished stone of ice, dropped one by one into the simmering silence of Aurelia, the city's most exclusive restaurant. 200 conversations stuttered and died. The tines of 100 forks froze halfway to mouths agape. All eyes swiveled to the restaurant's prime alcove, where the wife of the magnate Julian Blackwood stood, a vision of wrath in emerald silk. Her wrist, heavy with a serpent of diamonds and emeralds, was extended, a single, blood-red nail pointing not at the floor, but at the young waitress before her. "I said," Seraphina repeated, her voice a low, carrying whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "kneel and beg my forgiveness for what you've done." Before them, a tragedy was laid bare upon the antique Persian rug. A bottle of Chateau Petrus, a vintage that cost more than the waitress's annual salary, lay on its side, its lifeblood staining the priceless weave a deep, unforgivable burgundy. But it was the target of the spill that drew the collective gasp. A single perfect crimson splash marred the pristine white canvas of Winter's Hush, a minimalist masterpiece by the reclusive artist Ivan Zolotov, which Mr. Blackwood had just purchased for a rumored 7 figures and was displaying for the first time tonight. The waitress Clara Mayhew stood perfectly still. Her hands clasped behind her back in the restaurant's prescribed posture were the only sign of her turmoil, her knuckles white as bone. She was 21, with a face that was often overlooked for its quietness and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Tonight, those eyes were fixed on the deliberate, almost theatrical placement of the overturned bottle, the precise arc of the splash, the tiny, almost invisible tremor in Mrs. Blackwood's hand that had preceded the accident. The entire room held its breath, a captive audience to a public execution. They waited for the tears, the pleading, the inevitable collapse of a working-class girl before the altar of immense wealth. "No!" The word was not defiant. It was a statement of fact, spoken so quietly it was nearly swallowed by the vast, opulent room. Yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. Seraphina Blackwood had no idea that her carefully staged drama had just collided with a will forged in a silence far more profound than this. The pressure in the room became a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. Seraphina Blackwood's meticulously crafted face, a canvas of expensive creams and subtle surgeries, flushed a dangerous shade of puce. She took a step forward, her bespoke heels sinking into the plush carpet, making no sound. It was the advance of a predator. "Excuse me?" The whisper was now laced with venom. "Did a little girl who smells of dish soap and desperation just say no to me?" This was the second act. The spill had been the setup. The public dismantling was the main event. Around them, the city's elite pretended to resume their meals, but every ear was strained, every eye stealing glances. This was their entertainment, a blood sport played with words and status instead of swords and shields. "I said, no, Mrs. Blackwood," Clara repeated. Her voice was steady, a low, clear tone that belied the frantic drumming in her chest. She had seen it all. The way Seraphina's grip had tightened on the bottle, not for stability, but for aim. The subtle shift of her body, angling the fall. The flicker of triumph in her eyes a split second. Before the bottle even hit the floor, it was a performance, and Clara refused to be a player in it. "I will not kneel for a mess I did not make." Seraphina's mouth, a perfect Cupid's bow of crimson lipstick, fell open. It was an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. In her gilded world, direct contradiction was an alien concept, a language spoken only by failures and fools. She blinked, her mind scrambling to process this unprecedented breach of the natural order. "How dare you?" The whisper was gone, replaced by a rising shriek that made the crystal wine glasses tremble. "Do you have any idea who I am? My husband could buy this building, tear it down, and turn it into a private dog park by Tuesday if he felt whimsical." She spun around, searching for an ally, and found one in the form of Mr. Albright, the restaurant manager. He came scurrying from the shadows, a man whose spine had long ago been surgically removed and replaced with a flexible rod of pure sycophancy. He was pale and perpetually sweating, his life a tightrope walk between placating the powerful and terrorizing the powerless. His gaze flickered between the furious socialite and the stoic waitress, his brain performing a rapid, terrified calculation of allegiance. The result was a foregone conclusion. Mrs. Blackwood, I am profoundly, deeply sorry for this utter failure of service, he stammered, twisting his hands together. He then turned his full, unctuous fury on Clara. Mayhew, what is the meaning of this? This is inexcusable. The accusation was a lead weight, heavy with the assumption of her guilt, of her inherent carelessness, of her station. Clara had worked at Aurelia for 6 months. She was meticulous, punctual, and invisible, just as she was supposed to be. Her quiet efficiency had earned her the best sections, the ones reserved for staff who could be trusted not to exist too loudly. None of that history mattered now. It had been erased by the word of a Blackwood. I suggest you get on your knees and beg for Mrs. Blackwood's forgiveness this instant, Albright commanded, his voice puffed with borrowed authority. His loyalty wasn't to the truth, it was to the 9-figure net worth at the table. I will not, Clara said, her voice gaining a new resonance. The memory of her grandmother propped up in a worn armchair, her breathing labored, flashed in her mind. The medical bills were a mountain, and this job was her only pickaxe. But some things were not for sale, not for any price. If telling the truth means I lose my job, then that is a consequence I will accept. The words hung in the air, a cocktail of terror and liberation. She was staring into the abyss of unemployment, of failing the one person who depended on her completely, but she would face it standing upright. Serafina's rage dissolved into a cruel theatrical glee. This was even better than she had planned. Not just a simple apology, but a full-scale immolation. Fire her? She laughed, a sound like diamonds scraping on slate. Oh no, Albright. That's far too kind. I want her to learn. I want everyone in this room to see what happens when the help forgets its purpose. She began to circle Clara, her movements slow and deliberate, a shark assessing its prey. Her voice was now pitched for the entire room, a public address system of pure malice. You people come into our world and you think you can have opinions. You think your little feelings matter. You need to be reminded that you exist for one reason: to serve, to be silent, to be efficient, and to be grateful for the scraps we deign to throw your way. The thinly veiled language hung in the air like poison. Phones began to slide from designer purses and jacket pockets. The soft glow of recording screens bloomed around the room. The weight of 100 digital eyes pressed down on Clara. She could already see the headlines, the brutal comments, the gleeful dissection of her defiance by an anonymous online mob. But deep within her, a lifetime of training took over. Not the training of a waitress, but the training of a survivor. It was a skill honed in silence, born of necessity. For years, she had cared for her younger brother, Leo, who had been deaf since birth. She had learned to read the world in a different way, to find meaning in the shape of a mouth, the flicker of an eye, the subtle tension in a jaw. She saw the things that hearing people missed, and as Serafina continued her tirade, Clara's eyes drifted past her, to the table where Julian Blackwood sat. He had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, a marble statue of a man observing the chaos his wife had unleashed. He watched, his face a mask of bored indifference. But his hands, resting on the table, told a different story, and his mouth, though making no sound, was forming silent words, a whispered command to his wife. Clara's focus narrowed. The noise of the room faded away. Serafina's voice became a dull buzz. All that existed was the silent conversation happening 10 feet away. Julian Blackwood looked directly at his wife. His lips barely moved, but for Clara the words were as clear as if he had shouted them. Wrap it up. You've made your point. Don't mention Zurich. Zurich. The word was a key turning a lock in Clara's mind. It meant nothing to her, but the urgency in his silent command was unmistakable. Serafina, seeing her husband's silent instruction, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. She turned back to Clara, her performance reaching its crescendo. Your place, she hissed, is where I tell you it is. I know every gallery owner, every restaurant manager, every CEO in this city. After tonight, you won't be able to get a job scrubbing toilets in a bus station. She snapped her fingers, the sound sharp and final. The threat was absolute. The other servers froze, their faces pale. They knew it was true. The Blackwood name was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at Clara's future. Albright, ever the opportunist, moved in for the kill. Mayhew, you are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Two hulking men in ill-fitting suits appeared from the wings, their presence a final, brutalist touch to the scene. The staff averted their gaze, a collective wave of shame and self-preservation washing over them. Solidarity was a concept for people who weren't one paycheck away from eviction. Serafina smiled, a victor's smile. She had won. She had crushed the insignificant insect who had dared to buzz in her presence. As the guards moved to flank her, Clara did not look at Serafina. She looked past her, directly at Julian Blackwood. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. She held his eyes for a long, silent moment. She didn't need to speak. Her look conveyed a message far more chilling than any threat. I heard you. A flicker of something, confusion, then alarm, crossed Julian Blackwood's stone-like features. It was a crack in the facade, tiny but undeniable. He had been a silent observer, untouchable. But suddenly he was seen. This is not over, Clara said, her voice still quiet. But now it held the promise of a coming storm. The guards led her away, a silent figure walking tall through a sea of whispers. Behind her, she left a room full of people who believed they had witnessed a simple, brutal display of power. They had no idea they had just seen the opening move in a war that Julian Blackwood, a man who controlled empires, had no idea he was about to fight. And his greatest liability was the furious, triumphant woman smiling at his side. The rain-streaked window of the bus reflected the city lights as a blurry, indifferent smear. Clara sat hunched in her seat, the thin fabric of her uniform damp and cold against her skin. The scene from the restaurant replayed in her mind, a relentless loop of humiliation and fury. But beneath the anger, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to form. Zurich. The word echoed in her thoughts, a dissonant note in the symphony of the Blackwood's power. Her apartment was on the fourth floor of a walk-up that always smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp concrete. She found her grandmother, Eleanor, asleep in her armchair. The television on but muted, a habit from years of living with Leo. An old black-and-white movie played silently on the screen. Two actors were in a heated argument, their faces contorted with emotion. Without thinking, Clara's eyes followed their lips. You can't leave, Catherine. Not now. I sold the bonds for us. You fool, Jonathan. Those bonds were all we had left. It was as natural to her as breathing, a second language learned out of love. Leo was grown now, a graphic designer living 2 states away, but the skill remained, a part of her that few people knew existed. A secret sense. Eleanor stirred, her papery eyelids fluttering open. Clara, dear, you're home early. Her voice was thin, a reedy instrument that struggled with every note. The ever-present oxygen tank hissed softly beside her chair. The shift ended sooner than expected, Clara lied, forcing a smile as she knelt by the chair and took her grandmother's cool, bony hand. She couldn't tell her the truth. The knowledge that their precarious financial lifeline had just been severed would be a weight Eleanor's fragile health couldn't bear. There's soup on the stove, Eleanor said, her gaze drifting back to the silent movie. That Joan Crawford. She always knew how to make an entrance. Later that night, unable to sleep, Clara sat at their small kitchen table, her laptop open. The video was already everywhere. Titled Restaurant Karen Destroys Waitress, it had hundreds of thousands of views. She watched the shaky cell phone footage, her own face pale and defiant, Serafina a vortex of entitlement. The comments were a toxic sludge of racism, classism, and gleeful cruelty, with a few notes of support drowned in the noise. She forced herself to watch it again, and then a third time. She ignored the sound, focusing instead on the background. And there it was, Julian Blackwood, sitting impassive. She paused the video, zoomed in as much as the grainy footage would allow, and watched his lips. Wrap it up. You've made your point. Don't mention Zurich. It was exactly as she remembered. A secret instruction passed in plain sight. Why was he so afraid of that word? Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Julian Blackwood. Serafina Blackwood. Blackwood Industries. The search results painted a picture of dynastic power. Real estate, tech startups, private equity. They were pillars of the city, their name etched onto museum wings and university libraries. There were countless society photos, articles praising their philanthropic endeavors, interviews where Julian spoke of civic duty and corporate responsibility. It was a fortress of public relations, pristine and impenetrable. But Clara wasn't looking at the walls. She was looking for cracks. She spent hours sifting through business journals, shareholder reports, and obscure financial blogs. She found whispers of hostile takeovers, of smaller companies crushed under the weight of Blackwood Industries' expansion. But it was all legal, if ruthless. Then she changed her search term. Julian Blackwood Zurich. The results were fewer, more cryptic. A mention of a keynote speech he gave at a Swiss banking conference 3 years ago. A passing reference in an article about international art acquisitions. Nothing incriminating, nothing that explained the fear in his silent command. Frustration gnawed at her. She had a key but no door to unlock. As dawn began to gray the sky, an idea sparked. She remembered a series of articles from about a decade ago, a deep dive into corporate corruption in the city. The journalist had been relentless, connecting dots no one else saw. He had even taken a few shots at Blackwood Industries, hinting at offshore dealings before the story was abruptly killed, and the journalist seemed to vanish from the public eye. His name was Arthur Penhaligon, a new search. Arthur Penhaligon, journalist. The first few results were his old articles, brilliant and scathing. Then the trail went cold. Finally, she found him, not on a major news site, but on a small, self-hosted blog titled The Penhaligon Post. The design was dated, the posts infrequent. He wrote about city politics with a weary cynicism that bordered on despair. He was a ghost haunting the edges of the world he once commanded. His contact page listed a single anonymous-looking email address. With nothing to lose, Clara began to type. She didn't mention her lip reading. It sounded insane. Instead, she kept it simple. She told him who she was, what had happened at the restaurant, and she attached the video clip. And in the subject line, she wrote just 2 words. They mentioned Zurich. She hit send, closed the laptop, and listened to the hiss of her grandmother's oxygen in the pre-dawn quiet. It was a Hail Mary, a message in a bottle cast into a digital ocean. She had no idea if the ghost would even answer. 2 days passed in a haze of anxiety. Clara's applications for other service jobs were met with polite but firm rejections. The viral video had made her toxic. She was a liability, a troublemaker. The Blackwood reach was long and suffocating. The mountain of bills on the kitchen table seemed to grow taller each day. On the 3rd morning, a reply appeared in her inbox. It was short and dismissive. Kid, you got publicly humiliated. It happens. The rich are bullies. That's not news. The Zurich thing is probably nothing. Leave it alone before you get hurt worse. Disappointment settled in her stomach like cold lead. He didn't believe her. He was just another person telling her to stay down. But as she was about to delete the email, a second one arrived from the same address. My curiosity is a terminal disease. There's a coffee shop on the corner of 8th and Monroe. The Gilded Bean. Be there at 3 p.m. Come alone. Don't be late. The Gilded Bean was a relic from another era, a small, dimly lit place that smelled of roasted coffee and old paper. Arthur Penhaligon sat in a booth in the back corner, a man who seemed to be composed entirely of tweed, wrinkles, and the faint scent of whiskey. He had a shock of unruly white hair and eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat on the table next to a well-worn notebook. "You're the waitress," he said, not as a question. His voice was a low growl, gravelly from years of cigarettes and cynicism. He didn't offer her a seat. "I am," Clara said, sliding into the booth opposite him. "So, You think you stumbled onto the crime of the century because a rich guy mumbled the name of a Swiss city? He scoffed. Let me tell you something about people like Julian Blackwood. They don't make mistakes. They don't have whispered conversations about their secret evil plans in public. You misheard, or you're imagining things. He didn't mumble, Clara said quietly. He didn't make a sound. I read his lips. Arthur stared at her. He blinked slowly, then let out a short, harsh laugh. You read his lips. Of course you did. And I suppose you can also communicate with squirrels and predict the stock market by reading tea leaves. The condescension was a familiar sting, but Clara didn't flinch. She glanced out the window. Across the street, a man and a woman were having a heated conversation on the sidewalk. They were too far away to be heard, their voices lost in the city's hum. That man, Clara said, nodding toward the window. He's telling her that he can't go to her sister's wedding because he has to work. He's lying. He told his boss he was taking the day off to go fishing with his buddies. He just doesn't want to go to the wedding. Arthur followed her gaze, his expression a mask of disbelief. He watched as the woman across the street threw her hands up in frustration and stormed off. The man kicked at the pavement, then pulled out his phone. That's a neat trick, Arthur said, his voice laced with sarcasm. You could have guessed that a million ways. He's texting his friend Mike, Clara continued, her eyes still on the man. He's typing, crisis averted, see you at the lake. Don't forget the beer. Arthur fell silent. He stared at her, really looked at her for the first time. The dismissive smirk on his face slowly faded, replaced by a dawning sense of incredulity. How? My brother is deaf, Clara explained simply. I've been doing this my whole life. I see things other people only hear. The old journalist leaned back in his booth, his cynical armor visibly cracking. He ran a hand through his messy white hair, his mind clearly racing. He had spent his career chasing whispers, rumors, and anonymous sources. And now a 21-year-old waitress was offering him a key that could unlock mouths that were sealed shut. Blackwood, he murmured, his voice now devoid of sarcasm. I went after him once, 10 years ago. I had a source inside his company, a senior accountant. He was feeding me documents about a subsidiary, a shell corporation based in Delaware that was being used to launder money through European art sales. We were building the case, piece by piece. What happened? Clara asked. Arthur's eyes grew dark. My source had a boating accident. His car went off a pier. No witnesses. The police ruled it an accident. My editor got a call from Blackwood's lawyers. The story was killed. I was reassigned to writing obituaries. I quit a month later. They didn't just kill the story. They ended my career. They made me a ghost. He looked at Clara, and for the first time she saw not a washed-up cynic, but a wounded warrior. They mentioned Zurich, he said, repeating her own words back to her. The accountant. The last thing he told me before he died was that the final destination for all the laundered money was an untraceable account in Zurich. The air in the dusty coffee shop crackled with sudden, dangerous possibility. It wasn't just about a ruined painting or a lost job anymore. It was about a decade-old murder and a criminal empire built on silence. They think I'm nothing, Clara said, her voice a low, steady flame. A disposable waitress they could crush for sport. They don't know what I can do. They don't know what I saw. Arthur Penhaligon picked up his glass of whiskey and drained it in one swallow. He set the glass down with a decisive click. A spark had been reignited in his tired eyes, the ghost of the relentless reporter he once was. All right, kid, he said, pulling his notebook and a pen from his jacket pocket. They don't know yet, but they're about to find out. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Their investigation began in the dusty, book-lined cavern of Arthur's apartment. It was a place where time had stopped around 1998, filled with filing cabinets, overflowing ashtrays, and the ghosts of stories that had never been told. For Arthur, it was an awakening. The hunt was on again, and the cynicism that had been his shield for a decade began to flake away, revealing the sharp, obsessive mind beneath. For Clara, it was a crash course in espionage. The Blackwoods live their lives on camera, Arthur explained, pointing to a corkboard already covered with photos of the couple. Charity galas, Business conferences, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, they crave the spotlight. That's their vanity. We're going to turn it into their vulnerability. Their days fell into a rhythm. Arthur used his old, half-forgotten contacts to pull archived news footage from local TV stations. Hours and hours of B-roll that had never aired. Clara, with headphones on to block out the sound, would watch the silent footage for hours on end, her eyes scanning for any moment when Julian or Serafina were speaking privately, believing they were off camera or unheard. Her first breakthrough came from a 7-second clip from the mayor's annual foundation gala 2 years prior. In the background of an interview with a city councilman, Julian Blackwood was in a quiet, intense conversation with a man Arthur identified as Marcus Thorne, the head of the city's zoning commission. Clara played the clip over and over. Thorne is saying, "The environmental report is a problem, Julian. I can't bury it." And Blackwood replies, "Reports can be amended, Marcus, just like pensions can be enriched. Find a way." Arthur let out a low whistle. That's quid pro quo bribery, plain and simple. The waterfront development project. Blackwood got the city to rezone protected wetlands. Everyone screamed bloody murder, but the amended environmental report came out clean as a whistle. Thorne retired to a beach house in Florida 6 months later. They were pulling threads, and with every tug, the pristine tapestry of the Blackwood Empire began to unravel. They found more. A whispered conversation on a hot mic between Serafina and an art gallery owner, discussing the creative invoicing for a sculpture that would allow them to write off triple its actual value. A tense, silent argument between Julian and a political rival on the steps of City Hall, where Blackwood clearly mouthed the words, "I own you." Remember that. Clara compiled the transcripts in a locked file, each one a piece of dynamite. But it wasn't enough. It was her word against theirs, a lip reader's interpretation against a mountain of wealth and influence. "We need something concrete," Arthur said, pacing his small apartment. "Something that connects the whispers to the money. We need access." The opportunity came from an unlikely source. An invitation arrived at Eleanor's apartment, addressed to Clara. It was from Aurelia. Mr. Albright, in a letter oozing false sincerity, was offering Clara her job back. He wrote of second chances and forgiveness. But the real reason was clear, written between the lines. Serafina Blackwood wanted her back. She wanted her enemy under her thumb, a constant visible reminder of her power. It was a power play, a way to parade her defeated foe. "It's a trap," Arthur said immediately. "She wants to watch you, control you, maybe set you up for something worse." "I know," Clara said, her gaze firm, "but it's also an opportunity. It's access, and I have to take it. We're running out of money. Grandma needs a new oxygen concentrator. This one, it's not working so well anymore." The weight of her reality was a constant pressure. Justice was a noble pursuit, but her grandmother's next breath was a necessity. Clara's return to Aurelia was a masterclass in humiliation. Albright treated her with exaggerated, condescending kindness. The other staff kept their distance, their eyes a mixture of pity and fear. And Serafina Blackwood made it a point to dine there 3 times that week, always in Clara's section. She was cruel in 1,000 small ways. She would ask Clara for her opinion on the wine, only to laugh and tell the table, as if she would know the difference. She would accidentally drop her napkin and watch Clara bend to retrieve it. Each act was a small assertion of dominance, a reminder of her place in the world. But Clara endured it all. Her face was a mask of professional deference. She was the perfect, invisible waitress once more. But behind that mask, she was a spy. She watched and she listened with her eyes. And on the 4th night, her patience was rewarded. Julian Blackwood joined his wife for dinner. They were celebrating something. The air around them was electric. They had secured a major international deal, and with the deal came a problem. Clara approached their table to refill their water glasses, her movements slow and silent. They paid her no more mind than a piece of furniture. They were arguing, their voices low, but their faces were animated, their lips sharp and clear. "The influx of cash is too large," Julian was saying, his expression tight with controlled anger. "It will raise too many flags with the feds, especially with that new auditing protocol." We have to move the older assets out before the new funds arrive. So move them, Serafina hissed back, her eyes flashing. That's what Zurich is for. It's not that simple anymore, Julian countered, his lips barely moving. They're cracking down on undeclared accounts. We need a new channel. Something clean. That's why the Children's Benevolence Fund is so perfect. Clara's blood ran cold. The Children's Benevolence Fund was Serafina's pet charity, the one that got her on the cover of Society magazines, posing with sick kids. You're going to run the new money through the charity? Serafina asked, a hint of alarm in her voice. No, you idiot, Julian snapped silently, his patience gone. We're going to use the charity's new hospital wing project as a smokescreen. We'll inflate the construction invoices through our own shell companies. We skim a percentage off the top, pay the contractors, and the laundered money comes out the other side as legitimate profit from the construction. The donations from our offshore accounts will look like philanthropy. It's untraceable. He leaned back, a flicker of a self-satisfied smile on his lips. The groundbreaking ceremony is next week, at the gala. Once those shovels hit the dirt, the first transfer will be unstoppable. Clara backed away from the table, her heart hammering. This was it. The smoking gun. A direct confession of a plan to launder millions through a children's hospital charity. She got to the kitchen, her hands shaking. She relayed everything to Arthur in a coded text. His reply came seconds later. They just handed us the gun, the bullets, and a signed confession. The gala, kid. It all ends at the gala. But as she slipped her phone back into her apron, she felt a cold presence behind her. She turned to find Mr. Albright standing there, his arms crossed, a thin, unpleasant smile on his face. Mayhew, he said, his voice slick with menace. You seem awfully distracted tonight, so interested in our guests' private conversations. Mrs. Blackwood was right about you. You just can't be trusted. He held out his hand. I'll take that phone. Company policy. Panic seized her. Everything was on that phone. But then she looked past him, through the small window in the kitchen door. She saw Julian Blackwood looking directly at her, a cold, knowing look in his eyes. This wasn't Albright's idea. This was a command. They were suspicious. The net was closing. The week leading up to the Children's Benevolence Fund Gala was the longest of Clara's life. Albright had confiscated her phone, a symbolic neutering that left her feeling isolated and exposed. He watched her constantly, his eyes two beady points of suspicion. The Blackwoods didn't return to the restaurant, but their presence lingered, a cold shadow that fell over everything. Clara and Arthur could only meet in person now, in clandestine locations. A bench in a crowded park, the back of a city bus, the noisy food court of a downtown mall. The risk felt immense, the sense of being watched a constant weight on her shoulders. They're spooked, Arthur said during a hurried meeting over lukewarm coffee. Taking your phone was a warning shot. They suspect you know something, but they don't know what you know, or how you know it. They're arrogant. They can't conceive of your ability. They just think you're a nosy waitress. The gala is in 2 days, Clara said, her voice tense. I won't be working. I don't have access anymore. You will, Arthur said, a glint in his eye. He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the table. Inside was an engraved invitation to the gala and a press pass for a photographer from a small, independent news syndicate Arthur had a connection with. You're not going as a waitress. You're going as my assistant. He had used what was left of his savings to buy her a dress from a high-end consignment shop, a simple, elegant column of midnight blue silk that was a world away from her black and white uniform. He'd even bought her a small, discreet camera. You won't have your phone, but you'll have this. We need irrefutable proof. We need to catch them in the act. The night of the gala, the Grand Imperial Ballroom was a galaxy of shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulation. Clara felt like an imposter, a ghost in borrowed finery. Arthur, looking surprisingly dapper in an old but well-preserved suit, gave her a reassuring nod as they navigated the crowd. Stay close. Look like you belong, he murmured, and keep your eyes on Blackwood. Serafina was in her element, gliding through the room, a queen accepting the fealty of her court. Julian was more reserved, standing near the stage where a large architectural model of the new hospital wing was displayed. He was flanked by the mayor and a state senator, all three of them smiling for the cameras. Clara and Arthur positioned themselves near the back of the room, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement. Clara raised her camera, pretending to take photos of the crowd, but her lens was focused solely on Julian Blackwood and his powerful companions. The noise in the ballroom was a deafening roar of conversation and clinking glasses. No one could hear a thing, but Clara could see everything. The mayor was laughing, patting Julian on the back. His lips formed the words, "You are a savior to this city, Julian, a true philanthropist." Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in closer, his voice for the mayor's ears alone. Clara's focus narrowed, the world shrinking to the space of his mouth. "Philanthropy is just good business, Robert," Blackwood said silently. "My donation ensures the zoning variance for the downtown tower project goes through without a hitch. Your re-election campaign will find itself very well funded." Everyone wins. The mayor's smile tightened. He gave a short, jerky nod. It was a deal being sealed right there, in front of hundreds of people, completely invisible to all but one. Clara's finger trembled as she pressed the shutter, capturing the moment. It wasn't proof of the words, but it was proof of the meeting. The main event began. Serafina took the stage to a round of thunderous applause. She gave a tearful, masterfully delivered speech about the plight of sick children, her voice catching with emotion as she spoke of her deep personal commitment to the cause. It was a stunning performance. As she spoke, Clara saw Julian discreetly step away from the stage and move toward a private alcove at the side of the room. A moment later, he was joined by a severe-looking man in a European-cut suit. The man was holding a slim leather briefcase. "That's him," Arthur whispered in her ear, his voice tight. "That has to be the courier from Zurich. My source called him the German." Clara angled her body, aiming her camera through a gap in the crowd. The two men stood close, their backs mostly to the room. It was a difficult angle. The German was speaking rapidly, his face a mask of stern efficiency. Clara could only catch fragments. "Nah, transfer is primed. The account will activate on your signal. Irreversible." Julian nodded, his face grim. He spoke, but his back was to her. Clara couldn't see his lips. She felt a surge of panic. This was the moment, and she was missing it. She had to get closer. "I'm moving," she whispered to Arthur. Leaving him behind, she began to weave her way through the throng, her heart pounding. She used the excuse of getting a better photographic angle, smiling politely at people who blocked her path. She was 10 feet away when the German handed the briefcase to Julian. Julian didn't open it. He simply nodded and handed the man a small, plain envelope in return. The exchange was over in seconds. The German melted back into the crowd. Julian turned, the briefcase in his hand, his face set like stone. And for a terrifying moment, his eyes met Clara's across the room. There was no recognition. He just saw another face in the crowd, a woman in a blue dress with a camera. But then his gaze sharpened. A flicker of doubt crossed his features, a sense that he had seen her face before. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. "He's remembering. He's placing me." She forced herself to turn away, to lift the camera and take a picture of the chandelier. A picture of nothing. She could feel his eyes on her back. She had to get out. She started to move toward the exit, her mission forgotten, replaced by a primal need to escape. But as she reached the edge of the room, Serafina's speech ended. The lights brightened, and the crowd began to move. In the confusion, she felt a firm grip on her arm. She spun around, expecting to see a security guard, expecting to see Julian Blackwood himself. Instead, it was Serafina. Her smile was a terrifying slash of red lipstick, but her eyes were chips of ice. "Well, well," Serafina purred, her voice a venomous whisper in Clara's ear. "Look what crawled out from under a rock. I didn't realize we were letting the staff attend this year." Her grip tightened, her manicured nails digging into Clara's arm. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, little girl, but it ends now." From across the room, Clara saw Julian watching them, the briefcase still in his hand. He was no longer looking at her with suspicion, but with cold, dawning certainty. He began to walk toward them, his path clearing as people moved out of his way. The trap was sprung, and she was caught in the middle of it. Serafina's grip was like a vice. "You've been a thorn in my side since the day you started," she hissed, her face close to Clara's. "My husband thinks you're a threat. He's become paranoid. I think you're just a pathetic little girl who needs to be taught a final lesson in humility." The crowd around them was thinning as people moved toward the dance floor or the bars, but a small bubble of awareness was forming. People were starting to notice the confrontation. Julian was getting closer, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. Arthur was trapped on the other side of the room, his face pale with alarm. Clara knew she had only seconds. Flight was impossible. There was only one weapon she had left. She looked past Serafina's enraged face directly at Julian. "Don't," Clara said, her voice low but clear, not for Serafina, but for him. "Don't say a word." Julian stopped dead in his tracks, about 5 feet away. Confusion warred with anger on his face. Serafina laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, she's giving orders now. This is priceless." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a near-silent whisper meant only for Clara. "You are finished. When we are done with you, you will wish you were begging to scrub my floors. We will ruin your grandmother. We will ensure she never gets the care she needs. You will watch her fade away, and you will know it was your fault." It was a perfectly delivered, soul-crushing blow. A precise strike at Clara's greatest fear. And it was completely silent. But in her cruelty, Serafina had made a fatal mistake. She had forgotten her husband was watching. Julian saw the words form on his wife's lips. He saw the pure, unadulterated venom. And he saw the potential fallout. A public threat against a sick old woman? Even he knew that was a line you didn't cross where it could be seen. His face contorted in a silent, furious snarl at his wife. His lips formed a single sharp command. "Shut up, you fool!" And in that moment, everything clicked into place for Clara. The final move on the chessboard revealed itself. She didn't have to accuse, she didn't have to explain. She just had to reflect. She ignored Serafina. Her entire focus was on Julian Blackwood. Her face became a mirror of his own controlled fury. The professional mask of the waitress, the nervous facade of the party crasher, it all fell away. What was left was pure, ice-cold confidence. Her lips moved, forming the words he had just silently conveyed to his wife. She didn't speak them aloud. She didn't have to. She mouthed them perfectly, a silent echo of his own rage. "Shut up, you fool." Julian Blackwood froze. The color drained from his face, the carefully constructed universe of his power, a universe built on secrets and silence, shattered in an instant. It was impossible. No one could have heard him. No one could have known. It was like she had reached directly into his mind and plucked out his thoughts. The briefcase suddenly felt very heavy in his hand. He looked at this young woman, this waitress, and for the first time he saw her not as an insect, but as the most dangerous person he had ever met. The paranoia he'd been feeling wasn't paranoia at all. It was instinct. Serafina, feeling the sudden shift in atmosphere, followed her husband's horrified gaze back to Clara. She saw the silent words on the waitress's lips. She didn't understand. How could she? She just saw her husband's secret command being played back to him. And then Clara did something else. She looked at the briefcase in Julian's hand, then back at his face, and she mouthed one more word, a word that held the weight of a decade of crime, the ghost of a murdered accountant, and the destination of hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen money. Zurich. That was the word that broke him. Julian Blackwood, the titan of industry, the untouchable magnate, took an involuntary step back. The briefcase slipped from his nerveless fingers and hit the marble floor with a sickening crack. The latches sprang open, and stacks of neatly bundled, non-sequential $100 bills spilled out across the floor. An ocean of illicit cash, right at the feet of the city's elite. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The music screeched to a halt. 200 pairs of eyes stared, first at the money, then at the ashen face of Julian Blackwood. Serafina looked down at the cash, then back at Clara, her mind finally, belatedly, connecting the dots. The impossible had happened. The waitress had somehow heard the unhearable, known the unknowable. She hadn't just defied them. She had dismantled them. Her carefully constructed world, her status, her power, it was all evaporating before her very eyes, turning to smoke and ash on the ballroom floor. The humiliation was absolute, 1,000 times worse than anything she could have ever inflicted on Clara. It was not a defeat, it was an annihilation. A single ragged sob escaped her lips. Then another. Her perfect makeup began to streak as tears of pure, undiluted horror carved paths down her cheeks. She sank to her knees amidst the scattered money, not in a position of power, but in utter, abject ruin. Clara hadn't said a word aloud. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply shown them that their secrets were no longer safe. And in the silence, as the first camera flashes began to strobe and a path cleared for the federal agents Arthur had finally managed to summon, that was more than enough.